89. We have a really special lady with us this morning, and so I'm not going to stand up here and tell you everything that she's done and everything that she's going to do, other than to tell you that she has been on both sides of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., once for the Great American Sleep Out, and the next day to testify before Congress. I want you to see a picture of Beulah Lund as people saw her walking around Washington, D.C. I'm hoping Beulah will share with you what was it in her spirit that called her to go to our nation's capital and experience being a bag lady on the streets for 6 weeks. It takes a lot of courage, a lot of courage. Her message today, and the title of her talk, will be The Long Road to Nowhere. Ladies and gentlemen, Beulah Lund. I will put this on a chair.
Did you turn me on?
Oh, just a minute, we have to hook her up. You can't see. Here we go. I have to put you back together.
I feel like I'm wearing a heart monitor or something. I can't get away with nothing now.
There you go.
Thank you. It's a real privilege to be here today with you. How was your morning? You want to hear about mine? Nah, you don't. I went to a car wash because I was going to get all the grime of the farm off before I came into your city. And the car wash ate my $2, and halfway through the suds, deal, the thing quit. And so I decided, well, I'd get out and do a Fonzie on it, maybe kick it or something, and it took off. And so I got back into it, and I had suds on my eyelashes and everything. And I could just envision me hooked up to that thing with my foot up there, frozen to this thing. It was absolutely a horror story. When I got here, I couldn't open my door again. So if you hear about an unidentified flying object coming down I-90, it was this ice cube with suds on it. That was me. Well, how was your morning? I like it. I like things like this because afterwards you can laugh. I wouldn't tell you what I was saying when I was there. Today, I know this is a down subject for everyone. I'm going to put this thing down, okay? I'm going to set it over here until we have some questions from the public here. This is a down subject, and I know a lot of people like to put their head in the sand and not address it. However, we're going to address it one way or another. If we don't socially address it, and through our Congress, local, state, federal, if we don't address it that way, we're going to be addressing it in a much, much harder way, a much more expensive way. I have been doing case studies now for Time Life for the last 2 years since I did this little treat, and I'll be backing up a wee bit to tell you about the beginning of that. And I've seen many, many angry children that should be playing out in their backyards and should be free to go down to the corner store for a popsicle in the summer, or just to be free to have a roof over their head every night. That's a right of every American, don't you think? Well, that isn't the way it's happening in America today. And I never dreamed that we would have this problem. It came to me in a very shocking way. We had decided to take a trip with our Swedish foreign exchange student to New York for 6 days and 3 days in Washington, D.C., be 3 years in June. And I've lived on a farm. We live north of Spokane, and I'm just as Mrs. Anybody. In fact, I'm maybe a little less than that because I've never been out in the workforce in my life. I've done a lot of work inside. but I've never worked out 1 minute in my life. And so I'm really naive. My dad was a minister, and we had a real happy home. I didn't see the inside of the problems that came through the parsonage, at least. I knew people hurt, and I knew that we needed to care about each other. But there was a real awakening when I went to New York, and I'd been there before, but I didn't see it like I saw it then. I think I saw it through the eyes of our Swedish exchange student. I saw people in doorways and behind dumpsters and in alleys, and I saw children too, and it bothered me. And Sven said, "Is this America?" And I said, well, Sven, just wait till we get to the nation's capital. It's the most beautiful city in the United States. And so we proceeded on to Washington, D.C. We stayed at the Hyatt Regency on Capitol Hill. And it backed the world's largest shelter. So what I had been saying to Sven was a real contradiction. And it was also a contradiction to me. Because lying underneath the archives of things that were chiseled in granite and marble, like we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, and all that, the wonderful things that are America to most of us, were being defiled. They had people right underneath them. And it seemed like it was in a more a smaller area where we were walking over these bodies. And if you've ever been in Washington, D.C. lately, you know what I'm talking about. I saw families with little children, mothers, young mothers, standing in soup lines throughout the city. And all that time I was making excuses for the United States, our great nation, and I am American. Through and through. I'm married to a Swedish guy, and he sees a wonderful part of America too. That's why we're here. So don't get me wrong, I'm a very loyal American. But I do see a cancer that's eating away at our country. And it's not only in the larger cities, it's throughout our nation, even in the smaller towns. We have a homeless family in Deer Park. And they are moving from pillar to post, and this is the way it is happening to most families. They don't just land on the street. They might be evicted, and then they might go to a sister's house or a mother and father's house, and that relationship breaks down, and things become tense, and suddenly they're out. And there's nowhere to go. There isn't enough public housing. And I won't go into all the politics of it, but I think that each one of you need to see that your public servants are addressing this, because there won't be enough penal institutions to hold the people that will be there. They're ready to be put behind bars because of their display of anger. I see it. I worked in New York in April and part of May last year in the welfare hotels doing some case studies. And these children aren't children. That little spark in their eye is gone. And there's just a dullness in their spirit. And we have taken in, we've been foster parents for 27 years to hard to place children. And it's been so rewarding to take those traumatized children and give them back that spark and that hope. And I tried to do this with these children that I met in the shelters. And they didn't dare hope. They didn't dare hope. They pulled the blind down because it was too hard to hope for anything. It was like they had big placards on their necks saying, "No hope, no hope." And it broke my heart. I wanted to take them all home. But I promised David I wouldn't bring everybody home with me. When I got back from this trip to New York and Washington, D.C. with our family, I went to the library to try to find things written on this before Sven had to go home to Sweden. I didn't want him going home with a bad attitude. And there was very little 3 years ago written on it, very, very little. just some scanty surveys that weren't really even good surveys. And so I had nothing to say to him but tell him that I would look into it and find out why Americans were hurting so when this is supposed to be the land of opportunity, and it is to most of us. I searched all summer long, and it became a real preoccupation. And finally, I thought maybe I was really losing it. I thought, well, I'm 50 years old almost, and I'm going through menopause. And they're going to lock me up like Aunt Lucy and never look at me again. Because all I could think about it when I was making homemade bread or putting dishes in the dishwasher or getting into clean sheets at night were these people, these haunting faces. And I could not get away from it. And I talked to nothing else. And our daughter had brought home 2 other college students to save money. Do you kids do that? For the summer. And I talked to them about it. And they seemed to be so preoccupied with other things that they didn't want to hear it. And finally, my daughter told me, Mom, quit talking about this because people are going to start thinking you're funny. That's all you're talking about. And so I tried to squelch it, but it didn't squelch. And I have a friend that her husband is the head of the psychology department at Whitworth. And so when I need a shrink, I go to her, we have lunch, and when she needs to know a whole wheat bread recipe, she comes to me. So this is what happened. I went to Rachel, and I said, Rachel, what's going on inside? And she said, why don't you write your reflections down? Perhaps you can understand what you're going through. She said, Beulah, you can't save the world. And I says, well, no, but I don't know why America has to let people go this far, that they have to live in the streets with their children. So I wrote my reflections down, and at the end of the paper, and I kept a journal most of my life. It's just kind of, my thoughts about different things, and, it's for the memory box that my great-grandkids can look and see what their great-grandmother thought about what, And it's been an interesting way to relieve myself of a lot of tension and emotions and whatever, and during problems. And so anyway, I wrote it, and at the bottom of the page I put, I guess I'll just have to be one of them to find out where they're coming from. And it surprised me. I thought, well, how will I be one of them? I'm secure here. Dave's taken very good care of us, and I've never even had to work out in my life. I've been very fortunate, and I loved what I was doing with my kids, and I would have had 20 kids if I could have. I loved being pregnant, I loved having babies, and I loved children, and we took in hard-to-place kids, like I said. I loved every minute of that. But how would I ever become a homeless person? And so I went back to Rachel and I said, Rachel, I just don't understand it, but I feel like I just have to go and be one of them, just have to. And she said, well, what does David think about it? And I said, well, he doesn't think much about it. He's real protective. And but he realized after a few weeks that I didn't feel like I could survive without knowing more about this subject. And so when I bought a ticket for Washington, D.C. with my family's blessings, finally, they thought that I'd be home the next day, I found out. They said Rachel and a few friends of mine said, well, why don't you tell Dorothy Powers, who's the editor of the Chronicle and Review, associate editor, she's retired now, wonderful lady, why don't you tell her that you're going? And so I called and told her I was going. She had me come right in. And she said, would you like to report what you see? And I said, well, sure, no problem with that. And she says, well, you can call in every day. And I says, well, I was hoping to sense their isolation more and to really be alone and not to know anyone or not to talk to anyone. But I found out that I needed that after I got there. I found out that I really needed to keep in touch because I was soon losing touch with reality. It's a horrifying experience, especially for somebody as pansy as I am or was. And so I thought nothing of it. And she wrote the first of the series that she put out, came out the day before I left from SeaTac Airport. We went over to celebrate my 50th birthday, and my family gave me a birthday party. And over there, and a lot of our friends that we were raised over there came, and I announced to them that I was going. Well, as soon as she had it in the paper on Sunday, something happened to change my life completely, I guess. I've never been a public person, so at first I was really confused with this. Still am confused. I don't know why it has to be on me so much, because I'm not the real life event at all. And but it seems like it's kind of weird and bizarre and sensational, so I guess that's why people wanted to pick up on it. But it went UPI and AP instantly. And we had a foster daughter, a street kid, a 16-year-old, staying at the ranch while Dave took me over to SeaTac for me to launch on this trip. And she told them right where we were. So all the calls that came in, so we were getting calls from ABC and CBS and NBC and everyone from all over, even Paris called and wanted to talk to me and have an interview. And I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Well, you can imagine, waking up one morning just an ordinary person, and then the next minute people have a serious interest in what you're doing. And I was pretty confused, and also I was alarmed. I didn't have too many smarts, but I did know that if I was made public, I could have been killed. I could be killed, and I was very concerned about blending in. And so my husband told them, this is a problem that we're facing, and they said, well, if you give us an interview here in Seattle, we will lock it to the West Coast. So some drunk sitting on a bar stool in a pub in Washington, D.C. doesn't see this, this gal come on and say, I really, really want to know about the street people, and pick me off when I got there. But so we decided we would give them an interview, and if they'd all come at once, well, not knowing this is what's called a press conference. So we're quite taken aback with all the lights and the cameras and everything, and I never have gotten used to it. But anyway, I felt there was a genuine concern in a lot of their journalism. They aren't the people that everyone likes to hate, really. I've met some really neat ones. I've met some animals too, but most of them are really neat people. I really enjoy working with them. So the next day I left from SeaTac with cameras, and I got on the plane saying goodbye to David with a camera between us practically, and now I know why some people get in fist fights with cameras. I've never been a violent person, but here I was, and my poor husband was trying to reconcile himself to the fact that his wife was dingy and she was going out and doing something crazy, and saying goodbye to her after, all these years, and it was hard. And so when I got on the plane, I felt this fear. It was the first time I've ever been alone in my life. I've always had a big fantasy of being alone, maybe even being locked in solitary confinement, because we've always averaged between 7, 10, 12, 14 at our home. We have a big ranch house, and it was always filled. And suddenly, I was alone. I never even got to go grocery shopping alone. I'd have a little CP kid pushing the cart, and I was pushing the wheelchair or whatever, because he needed to feel needed or she needed to feel needed. And I always wanted to just have a real time with just a kind of a retreat by myself, and never got to it. So this was a shock, and it was something that I was not prepared for, because I never dreamed that the feeling would be so terrible. I was alone. And as the plane became airborne, I thought, well, Denver's the first stop. I'm getting off and I'm going back. And I thought, no, my family thinks I'm coming back in just a day or so, and I'm going to show them, even if I have to go sightseeing. And so I was sitting there, and I prayed, and I said, God, if you want me to do this, you're going to have to just give me peace about it, instead of just having me panic like this, because I was just becoming very panicky. And all of a sudden, I felt this real sense of mission, and I felt okay, that I was okay, and that I wasn't, slipping my cog. And so I just kind of sat there looking at these crazy magazines, you know, that all the planes have on them. And I was just thinking about, you know, well, I sure feel good about it. I'm glad that fear left. And all of a sudden, the stewardess walked up to me, and a steward, and I looked up, kind of startled, and there were these 4 stewardess and 1 steward. And I said, "Do you have a problem or do I have a problem?" And they smiled and they handed me this barf bag. And it was filled with, it said, a survival kit for our favorite bag lady. Good luck on the streets from your flight 220 crew, United. And that was just kind of God's sense of humor, I think. He gave me and it was filled with booze. It had 5 bottles of various booze, and I bartered with some of that, and some peanuts and some Band-Aids and a deck of cards, and it was so sweet. And I looked up and I said, "Well, how did you know who I was and what I'm doing?" And they said, well, they called from the boarding gate and said that there was a VIP on board, and look at your list, and they did, and they couldn't find anybody important. And so the one stewardess said, well, when she was getting ready for bed the night before at a hotel, she just glimpsed somebody saying something about a lady going out to be a bag lady, and remembered and connected that, and that's why they knew. But that was my first experience, and from then on, there was all sorts of fun times too, and I don't want to make this real heavy because I'm going to be getting into some heavy stuff. But that was how I was launched on the street, and it was very special. That might not sound too special to you, but it was. It was real special. And I had told my husband I would go to a hotel for 2 days and kind of regroup, and so when I got to Washington, D.C., I did that. And I called home to tell him everything went good, and the flight and all, and the barf bag. And he got a boot out of that, and he said, there's 2 calls that came in, and I want you to make the calls, return the calls in D.C. if you can. And I says, well, Dave, no, I want to feel their isolation. I need to feel that isolation that they feel. And he just about came over the airwaves at me, you know. He never is this way either, but he says, you call them, you've got to call them. One is the head of the shelters for the whole United States, and the other is ABC Studio, Good Morning America. And I says, I don't want to talk to them. I said I wouldn't talk to any of the reporters until I got off, except Dorothy Power. And he said, you need to call them, because they said if you would give them an exclusive with this, that they would probably leave you alone, then the rest of the reporters, and then you could do what you wanted to with it after that. And I hesitated even then, but he insisted. So I did call Carol Finley, who is the wife of Mitch Snyder. Have any of you heard of Mitch Snyder, the activist for the homeless in Washington, D.C.? Whatever has been done for the homeless has usually been done because of Mitch. He's a typical activist. You have a hate-love relationship with him. It's just very intense, never smiles or anything, but he has gotten a lot done. He went on the hunger fast 40 days in front of the Capitol to have President Reagan on board some of the shelters, and some of the schools that were boarded up for shelters because people were freezing to death in the street. Anyway, I called Carol, and she came over, and she's told me later she's checking my sanity. And she told me about all the terrible things that could happen. She says, I can see right now that you're pretty naive. And I says, yeah, I've never been around much, you know. And she says, well, there's a lot of things that can happen on the street, and you aren't a typical homeless person, and you never will be. And she says, I feel a real responsibility to tell you this and warn you of this fact. And so we talked for a while, and I says, well, Carol, I can't do anything but go with this. I have tried all summer to get preoccupied with other things, and I couldn't even enjoy a day at the lake or anything because I've been so worried about these people and wondering what's going on and why it's going on and why they're there and if they really want to be there. And she said that she just looked at me. She said, I said, in July, I decided, I made the decision the last of July, 1st of August. She looked at me and she says, I can't believe this because we have been praying that someone would bring it into the focus of the public since July, all of us across the nation that are involved in this. and you're our answer if you will let us use you. And I said, well, yeah, but how can you use me? I mean, I don't know 2 cents about what's going on. And she said, well, just go out there and be whatever you'd plan to be, and we'll try to watch out for you. And so she took me on a trip around the city and showed me the different shelters and the different soup kitchens and the places to stay away from and not to go into at night, and the places don't not go in at all, go into areas at all. And it seemed like all the soup kitchens and the shelters were in those places. But she was warning me and giving me a real fast lesson on how to survive on the street. I really feel like I was really blessed to have her. I don't think I would have lived if it hadn't have been for Carol Finley and Mitch Snyder. I went out on the street then after the 2 days, after talking to ABC Studio, came over to the hotel representative, and I agreed to go with Good Morning America when I come off the street if they promised they wouldn't do any filming of me until right before I came off. And they promised they wouldn't, and they would let me know when they would do filming. And so they told me I could keep my things up at the ABC Bureau in Washington, D.C., and that was really neat. I had a lot of spin-offs from this that was fun. I got to meet some really neat people. I cleaned up in Steve Bell's dressing room, and I was surprised to see how short he was. I thought he was a big man. And met Peter Jennings and Ted Koppel, a few of those people. And that was really neat. They probably, just glanced at me, but I really thought it was neat to meet them in person, people that I'd seen, sitting across the desk and giving us the world news and all that. And it was real humbling to be able to meet them. When I met Peter Jennings, I had been on the street for 3 weeks. I was on the street a total of 6 weeks. 3 weeks after I'd begun, I was pretty grimy and pretty dirty. I'd taken the disguise of a bag lady, because if you acted eccentric and as dirty as possible and looked as dirty as possible, it would be a protection. That's about the only smarts I had. And I did feel protected a lot by that, and I did throw a lot of crazy actions that, to ward off some attacks and assaults and that, like spinning in the middle of the street and talking to myself, and I got a big bang out of the way people gawked at me. But it's kind of fun to act dumb and have a real reason for it. So anyway, I did get to meet a lot of people, and Peter Jennings came in after I was on the street for 3 weeks, and I was so grimy and dirty that I had to force my eyes up to look at him, and I couldn't hardly get him past his hands. And he knew who I was. He knew the whole story. But for some reason, I had been dehumanized so much, and I have always taken real pride in having eye contact. I mean, I just want eye contact. I just got to get in somebody's skin, I just got to have eye contact. That's why I told him not to dim the house lights today, because I like to see you, and I like to, be one-on-one. And so it was a real shocking thing for me not to be able to look up. And it was kind of the proudest moment of my life, and I couldn't even enjoy it, And I just could not get my eyes up past his hands hardly. And I just glanced, and then I realized I was in that stoop position, that I'd taken this on, even though I knew that I had an end to this. There's something about street life, and there's something about filth, and there's something about people rejecting you and treating you like an extension of some sidewalk that just breaks the spirit and saps the spirit out of each person, even children. And, I've seen little kids come into our home with a failure complex and a rejection from everyone. And I met with that head on, and I became part of that suffering at last. I really understood where they were coming from. I wish I'd had that lesson many years before. I would have probably been a much better foster mother. But the heartache was there. I saw people, and I saw a ditch that was didn't have an end to it. When you get down that far, how can you clean up for a job interview? How can you have any confidence that you can make it again, even if you've been a school teacher? I have a friend that's a school teacher, and she lost her job because she has schizophrenia, and she had handled it really well with medication, and then went on a health food kick. And I'm not condemning that, because I grind my own wheat to make my own bread, and I have nurtured kids out of all sorts of problems with good diet, and not knocking that. But she felt that she didn't need medication to keep her stable anymore. But I want to tell you that there's a lot of college people out there, college graduates out there in the street. And that, you know, when I mention the homeless or a street person to you, what comes into your image right then? It's usually the derelict, isn't it? That's what is stereotyped as for years, and properly so, because every urban center has this type of a person, but they need help too. And I've come away with a less judgmental attitude towards these people too, because they're covering a lot of pain with booze and drugs. And we can't be so judgmental and critical of them, because by gum, if I'd been on there much longer, I would have really been hitting the bottle just to be able to sleep at night, or just to be able to handle the rejection that you feel from everyone. So it's really been a real eye-opener to me to face that head on. I've had people in boxes for so long, and I didn't think I was self-righteous. I really have been real flexible with people's problems, I thought. But I realized that you know, you and I as Americans really have to take a different look at our brother, because we're part of that chain of humanity. And when somebody hurts, it's us hurting too, especially us Americans that have been our brother's keeper, and been, you know, the barn raising, the house raisings, and all the pioneer days of people sticking together and helping each other. We've got to come back to that. When I got onto the street full time after those few days, I found that a shelter for at night, and I really became real close to my shelter sisters. It's an old school. In fact, it's the school where President Kennedy signed the school integration law into effect. And it's in the ghetto of Washington, D.C., and it was mostly black people there, and I've never been in the black community much, and I was afraid with a lot of them, and I became so attached to them. When I came in there, I knew that I couldn't fool them. At first I thought I'd just tell them that, you know, I'm a bag lady, but I just told them that troubles had driven me out on the street. I knew I had to be more honest with them, because they're sure bright. And I said, I've never been out before, but troubles have driven me out, and I'm really scared. And when I said that, my room of 17 gals, and I was the only white one in there, really became my defenders, and they tried to all show me the ropes. And I love them, and I just have really found a new love for another part of humanity that I had never been around, and very close-knit and bonded to a lot of my friends back there still, the ones that I am able to tell that I'm a different person now, because it's really a violation to someone to pretend to be someone else, and then it's almost like exploiting them. And so I've had to be real careful with who I told who I am, just a couple people. When I stayed there, I had to be out by 7 in the morning like all of the rest of them. And there's a reason almost every shelter does that. And there's a reason for that, because if they would just kind of vegetate if they stayed in, you know, all day long in the shelters. And it wouldn't be very healthy, because there's lots of diseases and lots of problems that are there. And things are ready to explode just, you know, if you step on somebody's foot, or there's so much going on inside of them that they don't, you know, it doesn't take much to ignite it. And every night there were fights, knife fights. I've been under a couple of knife fights, and I scooted under a cot to get away from it. And it's not because they're going to kill each other. They just need that show of power. And so it's more of a song and dance. And I didn't know that at first, so I thought everybody was going to be killed by morning. And I got where I could sleep through it a little bit. One little gal that was in my room was definitely the top sergeant, and she had been in the military, and they warned me about her. When Audrey comes in tonight, we would get there, most of us would get there about 4:30 because it opened at 5, and we stand in line to get into the shelter. She would come in at 11, and she had such tenure that she had her cot, and she would come in at lockup every night, and she'd be pretty drunk. And she was out on, she had been in jail for 8 years on manslaughter charge. And she was out on parole. And they said, be careful with her, you know, whatever she tells you to do, you do it, because she can kill you. And I believed them. And she would come in and she'd get everyone up every night. It was just like a military movie. And we'd stand by our cots, and she'd rant and she'd rave, and she'd go on and she'd go on and call us everything under the sun. And I learned words I've never heard. And she just, and then all of a sudden she'd shut up and go to bed. I mean, she'd just flop on her cot and instantly, you know, and everybody just climb back into bed on their cots. And we didn't have blankets or pillows. We just had our cot. Some people had blankets that they carried with them all the time. All of us carried all of our possessions with us at all times. She would fall asleep, and I thought, I am not getting up for her. I mean, there's got to be an end to this. And so when she came in, the lights went on, and she stood by her cot, and she yelled for everybody to get up, and everybody stood at attention. And I decided I'd been on my feet all day. My feet were blistered, and I was really, really tired. The cultural shock had set in, and I just was not getting up. And all of a sudden, I felt the steel against my carotid artery, and I knew she meant business. And she said, you stand up, or you're not going to live. And she said, you won't live to see morning. And she said, you shut your eyes one time, and she called me all these wonderful names, and you're dead. And so I thought, well, I'm not dying laying down. So I swung my feet around, and I looked around, and I saw all these beautiful people that had been just hamburgered out by life. And I broke my heart, and I was scared. I was scared to death. And I started to cry. And I thought, oh, you know, here it goes. I'm showing my weakness. And she dropped her scissors. She had, most of them in that area carry sharpened scissors, because if they're caught, they can't say it's, you know, a switchblade or whatever. And boy, I tell you, they have a stone, and they pass it around and sharpen everything. And she laid her sharpened scissors down, and she just took me and hugged me and rocked me and said, you're okay, white trash, you're okay. You go ahead and cry. And from then on, Audrey and I were just like this. She was just my defender. I mean, no one bothered me in soup line or anything with Audrey around. But I tried to analyze that the next day, and I thought, you know, she had been oppressed for so many years by people, white people like me, that when she saw how oppressed I felt, she really identified, and our spirits just clicked. And she understood my pain and the oppression that I felt. And she just laid the scissors down, and she just took me and rocked me, and she's a very gentle soul. I stood up after that too, though. But she's a wonderful lady, a neat lady, and a tough old broad, but she's a neat lady. She's older than I am. And, you know, only God is older than I am. But she was in the military, and she was in Korea at one point in her life, and I think this has kind of stuck with her. And she's going to clean up the whole place, you know, and have us all stand, show us what pigs we were and how dirty the place was, and that we have to clean it with a toothbrush. And I mean, she went on and on and on forever sometimes, and then she'd fall over it, you know. But anyway, it was neat to know this other side of another person. So it's challenged me since then when I'm doing these case studies for Time Life now. We're doing a book. The director of research for Time Life Books contacted me, and in fact, she did the article on the story in People magazine. And she asked if I would be interested in doing a book, and I said, oh no, I would like to work with the people, and that's mainly what I would like to get into. And she said, well, I think we really could get the word out quicker if we did a book. So I decided I would do a book with her, and that's what I'm working on, all the case studies. And I found people that are just like you and I. I found a guy that had a master's degree in philosophy, was the worst drunk that I always felt fairly comfortable with him because he was so drunk all the time. And he wouldn't, when he threw up, the food wouldn't even leave his beard, or whatever. And he wouldn't even roll out of his own vomit. When I came back, and that was in November, came back in January, and this man at the switchboard at the National Coalition said, "Hi, Boo, how you doing?" And I said, "Well, how do you know who I am?" And he said, "Well, I'm Charles from Farragut Park." And I says, "Oh, no, you aren't." And he said, "Yes, I am." I says, "What happened?" He says, "Well, I fell out in front of the house of Ruth right after Thanksgiving." And he said, I went unconscious, and then the nuns came out and picked me up and brought me in, called an ambulance, and they said if I was going to live, I couldn't take another drink. And I said, "Well, I'll have to die then, because I have to have my bottle." And he said that the nuns took him home and said, "Yes, you will live." And they prayed for him 24 hours out of the day for 2 weeks. He said someone was at his feet praying on this when he was there. And he said, "I've gone through detox. It's just a joke. I've gone through detox so many times." And he said that made the difference. Someone cared enough to be there at all times. And he's still sober. He's doing great. In fact, Martin Sheen, who is a real good activist for the homeless, I got to sleep out with him quite a few times. Eat your heart out. My kids say it's nothing until it's Charlie. But he's a neat guy, and he brought all of his family in to a hotel in Washington for his surprise at Christmas this year. His wife has been remarried, and she's a professor and at Salisbury State College in Maryland. And his kids, and they all came, and they had this beautiful reunion with their dad. And so there is hope. And I want to instill that in your hearts today, because it's a down subject. It's a hard subject to talk about, but we do have to face it. But there is hope, and it's going to come from you and I. And we've gotten away from values in our society somewhat. And every time I look at a case study, I can point it back to some value that we have departed from. And I don't know what you would call your values today, but if it's not helping your neighbor, and if it's raising you on the throne, that I must have everything, the greed and all this kind of thing, the big me, if it's that is destruction. It brings death. If you can look out for your neighbor, and no matter what, love them unconditionally. If it's that teenage kid that you can't get along with in your family, or your mother, or your father, try to look through another eye at them, because that's the only way this nation is going to survive, I'm convinced. Ted Koppel, in his address to the graduating class at Duke University last year, said, "Where have we gotten away from right and wrong? Shoot up if you must, but use a clean needle. Have sex with whoever, whenever, but use a condom." Where have we gotten away from the right and wrong in our country? There is rights and there are wrong. Not because you maybe be dying someday in an AIDS ward at some hospital, a very lonely death, or whether it is any other type of a thing that you might be reaping the consequence from. Don't do it because of that. Do it because it's right, not because of something that you can get out of it. Do what you can to help your fellow man, but do what you can to help yourself, because there are people hurting out there. We need to look around us. For so many years, I had people coming into my home that I could fix and I could help, but I didn't go out and look for them. And I'm just overwhelmed with the need that I see everywhere I go. I'm going to be going to NATO with the head of bioethics and biolaw, and we're having a symposium on homelessness in this world. And you know, we have a higher rate per capita of any of the Western nations, and we're going to have to address it. And it's going to have to be done by you and I as public citizens. You know, ride your elected officials. Tell them you want something done. I am amazed wherever I go that people don't know who their congressmen are. And they don't know when they come into their area. And they do make trips back and forth. And you can talk to them one-on-one. I know Tom Foley chaired our homeless bill in the House. And we got $1 billion after sleeping out on the concrete and on the grates and freezing our AWQs off. And it took us all that to get $1 billion out of Congress, which was a Band-Aid, and Band-Aids don't last. It's going to take much more than that. We're going to have to demand lower cost housing. We're going to have to demand that poor mother with 3 children finds cheaper daycare and is assured of a job when she's sick, when she comes back. And we're going to have to demand that greedy landlords do not evict people like that. And that we're going to have to demand that people be the humans that we are made to be. You know, Ted Koppel said that we've spent all these thousands of years climbing out of that medieval slime that we were in, and now what are we doing with it? What are we doing with the industrialized nation that we have? We're going to robots, you know, to do the work that 5 men could have done because somebody wants more money. And we're going to have to realize that there's you and I, and we are accountable for each other. And when we step into somebody's suffering, though, we're going to be vulnerable. I tell you, I have been so vulnerable, and I become a victim of their suffering with them. And I want to warn you that that's exactly what you'll do. That when you step into someone's suffering, I don't care if it is a little grandma down the street that just lost her husband, don't wait for 3 months to go back and get the casserole you sent for the funeral, for the dinner after the funeral. For Pete's sake, go down and say that you care, you want to know if she's hurting, and you want to take her for a ride on Sunday, and you want to be that companion to that little mother that works all week for minimum wage and comes home to 3 children that need her attention. Go down there and say, I'm going to take the kids on a Saturday and you're going to sleep all day Saturday. How much more better will you feel from it? I know I have. I felt much better since I've been doing a few things like I should do much more than I do. But I want you to know that your real happiness and your real peace in your life is coming on outreach. It is not coming from reaching in. And it's been proven time and time again. And I just want to tell you that you can make a difference. I never dreamed I could. I'm just a Mrs. Anybody. I don't even know how to speak. I'm probably driving every one of you crazy with the way I'm talking because I told my husband, I says, as soon as I slow down long enough, I'm going to take execution lessons. And he says, Beulah, it's elocution lessons. And so, but if my participles are dangling and all that, please forgive me. But all I can say is I have a message to tell you that we need to care, we need to be aware, we need to share, and we need to bear. And if you can go home with those 4 things and remember them and say to yourself, did I do that for someone that I wouldn't get anything back from today? Did I do it just because I'm part of that humanity that's out there? Because that's when America will be built up again in the strength that she's been built in before. And I'm happy because every place I go, I see people that really catch the spirit. And you know, my topic is a long road to nowhere. And that's exactly what it is when you're on the street, because you're shuffled from pillar to post. You're just moved along to keep you from cluttering the landscape. And I would like to add something to that topic right now. I would like to say the long road to nowhere, and does it make a difference? Doesn't make any difference if people have a long road like that. Out of every auditorium that's this size, I can guarantee you there'll be at least one of you that will be found homeless in a situation of homelessness at some point in your life. And I'm scared for you. I'm scared for you. I really am. We've got to be our brother's keeper. The Judeo-Christian ethics that this country was founded on, that's the main thing about it, is that we are our brother's keeper. And that we shouldn't be giving a hand out, but a hand up. And I really am a firm believer, and I have no pat answers, that when we do give somebody something for nothing, that it takes something from them. It takes a respect, it takes the will to go on, to strive. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can do this and solve this problem, which will give people dignity. I was on a talk show in Cincinnati with Ira Joe Fisher. Some of you remember him? He's really a neat guy. And 2 days before that, I was on the street with a reporter, and I was at a Jewish synagogue speaking the next night, and on this topic, and they were launching a campaign on warmth for the city. I was on the street with this reporter, and I saw this little gal coming out of a shelter with 2 little black children with her. And it was a mother, and she had had 2 years of junior college. And her husband had just left her about 3 months before, and she had 4 more days to stay in the shelter. And that was the maximum that she could stay because there just wasn't enough room. And they had to keep them moving, which is, most shelters are like that. And I said to her, you know, you're what it's all about. Would you mind, excuse me, would you mind coming with me on the Ira Joe Fisher show on Monday? And she said, well, I said, I don't want to violate you in any way. Think about it, and then I'll get back to you tonight. And as the day proceeded, I really felt more and more that she was what it was all about. And so I went over to the shelter, and she says, yes, I've decided I would come out with my story. And so I took her on the Ira Joe Fisher talk show. It's an Eastern Seaboard show. And she was just a hit of the show. It was really neat. And I told about her being a mother with 2 children, and she'd been to college, 2 years, junior college, but she hadn't any skills. And her folks were angry with her because she'd married the wrong guy, and so lay in your bed, you made it, you know, that attitude. And so she had no one to turn to. And at the end of the show, there were calls coming in. And one was a teacher that was homesick with the flu that day. And she said, you know, we've been looking for someone to live in. We have a large daylight basement that could be hers if she is available for the job. Would she come out and be interviewed? So they took her out to be interviewed. And Gloria now is in her 3rd year of college. She's going to school at night. She takes care of their children in the daytime. She's just been a wonderful asset to the home. And her children are taken care of by the teacher and her husband, who is also a teacher, in the evening so she can go to college. And I am so happy about that, because just connecting is all we need to do. And I just want you to know that you can do it too. You can connect. Mother Teresa said something that was really wonderful. She said that when we reach out our hand to the oppressed and the needy, we touch the very heart of God. And I could say an amen to that. Thank you. And I would like to have some questions right now if anyone has any. And I'll just sit down here, and if you'll come down and address it to the mic so people can hear you. And I'll try to answer. I have no pat answers, but I would be glad to do that if you would like to.
Yeah.